I've lived most of my life in the quiet backwoods of Vermont, where the trees grow thick, and the silence of the forests feels like a second skin. As a park ranger, I've seen more than my fair share of oddities. Strange lights in the sky, ghostly figures flitting between the trees, even a couple of Bigfoot sightings that the tourists love to spread around. But none of that compares to what happened last September in the most remote part of my park, a stretch of wilderness known simply as the Northern Reach. The Northern Reach is a place few people venture. It's dense, labyrinthine, and almost unnaturally silent. Cell service doesn't work there, compasses tend to spin uselessly, and most animals seem to avoid it altogether. It's an untouched slice of wilderness that we've always treated with a cautious respect. Visitors are warned not to go there, but every once in a while, someone gets curious. That's where this story begins. The call came in around dusk, a man named Brian Miller reporting his brother missing. Brian and his brother Nathan had been hiking the reach for a few days, something they'd done every fall for the past 5 years. This time, though, Nathan had vanished overnight. One minute he was in his tent, the next he was gone. Brian spent the better part of the day searching for him. But when the sun started to dip below the horizon, he panicked and called for help. By the time I reached their campsite, it was pitch black, the kind of darkness that seems to swallow light. Brian was sitting by the remains of their campfire, his face pale and drawn. He was a stocky guy in his early 40s, but he looked like he'd aged a decade in a day. He didn't just leave, Brian said, his voice trembling. He wouldn't do that. His boots, his jacket, they're all here. He wouldn't go into the woods barefoot. I scanned the campsite. It was a mess. One of the tents had been shredded, the fabric hanging in ribbons. Something heavy had crashed through the area, leaving deep gouges in the dirt. I knelt to examine one of them. It wasn't a bear or a mountain lion. The claw marks were too long, too precise. "Did you see or hear anything?" I asked. Brian shook his head. "Nothing." I woke up, and he was gone. But there was this smell, like wet earth and sulfur. It's gone now. I didn't like the sound of that. Wet earth and sulfur weren't exactly the calling cards of any animal I knew. "We'll find him," I said, more to convince myself than him. We set off into the woods, our flashlights cutting narrow beams through the oppressive darkness. The air felt heavy, as though the forest itself was pressing down on us. Every sound, every crunch of leaves, every snap of a twig felt magnified, like the forest was listening. About an hour into our search, we found the first sign of Nathan. A scrap of his flannel shirt was snagged on a low branch, torn and blood-stained. Nearby, the underbrush had been flattened as though something large had passed through. "Could be a bear," Brian muttered, though he didn't sound convinced. We followed the trail deeper into the woods, the smell of wet earth and sulfur growing stronger with every step. Brian kept calling his brother's name, his voice growing more desperate as the hours dragged on. The forest didn't answer. Eventually, we stumbled upon a clearing. In the center was a massive oak tree, its gnarled roots twisting above the ground like claws. At the base of the tree was an opening, a dark, jagged maw that led into the earth. The sulfur smell was overwhelming here, almost making me gag. "He wouldn't have gone in there," Brian said, his voice barely above a whisper. But I wasn't so sure. There were fresh scuff marks on the dirt leading into the hole, and a faint trail of blood. I took a deep breath, steeling myself. "Stay here," I said. "I'll check it out." "No way," Brian said, grabbing my arm. "I'm coming with you." We descended into the hole together, the beam of my flashlight revealing slick, damp walls. The air was cold and stale, and the deeper we went, the more I felt like we were trespassing somewhere we didn't belong. The tunnel opened up into a cavern, the walls glistening with some kind of strange, black moss that seemed to pulse faintly, like it was alive. In the center of the cavern was Nathan. At least it looked like Nathan. He was crouched on the ground, his back to us, his head tilted at an unnatural angle. His clothes were shredded, his skin pale and stretched taut over his bones. As we approached, he turned to face us. His eyes were gone. In their place were dark, empty sockets that seemed to swallow the light. His mouth twisted into a smile that was too wide, his teeth sharp and jagged. When he spoke, his voice was layered, like multiple people were talking at once. "Why did you come?" it asked. "You shouldn't be here." Brian froze, his breath hitching in his throat. "Nathan?" The thing wearing Nathan's face tilted its head, as if considering the question. Then it stood, its movements jerky and wrong, and began to walk toward us. "Run," I said, grabbing Brian's arm and pulling him back toward the tunnel. We didn't look back. The sound of footsteps followed us, along with a low, guttural growl that echoed off the walls. My heart was pounding in my chest, my lungs burning as we scrambled back toward the surface. The sulfur smell was choking now, filling my nose and throat. We burst out of the hole and into the clearing, gasping for air. The footsteps stopped, but the growl didn't. It was louder now, coming from the hole, and the ground beneath us began to tremble. "We have to go," I said, pulling Brian to his feet. We ran, the forest a blur around us. Behind us, the growl grew louder, deeper, and I could swear I heard something moving through the trees, keeping pace with us. It wasn't until we broke through the tree line and reached the safety of my truck that the noise stopped. Brian and I didn't speak on the drive back to the ranger station. There was nothing to say. I filed my report, leaving out the parts no one would believe, and the northern reach was officially closed to the public. Missing person posters for Nathan went up, but we both knew they were pointless. I still don't know what we encountered in that cavern. But I know one thing for sure, the northern reach isn't just a stretch of untamed wilderness. It's a doorway, and sometimes it lets things through. Brian sat in the passenger seat of my truck, shaking silently, his face a pale mask of shock. I wanted to reassure him, to tell him that we'd figure this out, but deep down, I wasn't sure we would. The thing in the cavern wasn't Nathan, at least not anymore, and that realization had turned the weight of our mission into something darker. The northern reach had taken Nathan, and it wasn't finished. We reached the ranger station close to midnight, the windows glowing faintly against the pitch-black forest. As soon as we stepped inside, Brian collapsed into one of the chairs, his head in his hands. I gave him a bottle of water and took a moment to steady myself. The room felt smaller than usual, the walls pressing in. "I'm going back out," I said finally, grabbing the emergency flashlight from the shelf. Brian shot up, his eyes wide with disbelief. "You're kidding, right? After what we just saw?" I shook my head. "There's something in the northern reach, Brian. If we don't figure out what it is, more people are going to disappear." He hesitated, his jaw clenching. "Then I'm coming with you." "No," I said firmly. "You've been through enough. Stay here, lock the doors, and don't let anyone or anything in." Before he could argue, I was out the door and back in the truck, the engine rumbling to life. The drive back to the clearing was quiet, save for the distant hum of crickets and the occasional rustle of leaves. But as I got closer, that eerie silence began to creep in again, swallowing the natural sounds of the forest. When I reached the clearing, the sulfur smell hit me like a wall. The gnarled oak tree loomed ahead, its roots twisting into the earth like skeletal fingers. The cavern mouth yawned open, black and uninviting. I stood there for a long moment, my flashlight shaking slightly in my hand. Then I descended once more. The tunnel felt colder this time, the damp air chilling me to the bone. The black moss on the walls seemed to have spread, its faint pulse stronger, more insistent. My footsteps echoed in the stillness, each one a reminder that I was completely and utterly alone. As I reached the cavern, I stopped short. It wasn't empty. Nathan, or what was left of him, wasn't alone. There were others, half a dozen figures standing in the shadows. Their postures were unnatural, their limbs contorted in ways that made my stomach churn. Like Nathan, their eyes were hollow sockets, and their mouths hung open in grotesque silent screams. The figures moved as one, turning toward me in unison. My flashlight flickered, the beam dimming as though the very presence of these things was draining its power. My breath caught in my throat as I took a step back, my boots scuffing against the slick floor. "You shouldn't have returned," Nathan's voice echoed, layered and otherworldly. "You don't belong here." "What are you?" I demanded, trying to keep my voice steady. Nathan's head tilted again, that same unnerving angle. "We are the Watchers. The forest is ours. Your kind does not belong." Before I could respond, the cavern began to tremble. The walls shuddered, and the black moss seemed to writhe, its pulses sinking with the growing vibration. A low guttural roar erupted from deeper within the cavern, a sound so primal it made my blood run cold. I turned and ran, my flashlight barely cutting through the darkness as I scrambled back toward the surface. Behind me, the roar grew louder, joined by the sound of footsteps, too many to count, chasing me through the tunnel. My lungs burned, my legs screamed in protest, but I didn't dare slow down. I burst out of the cavern and into the clearing, the cool night air hitting me like a slap. But I wasn't alone. The figures had followed me, spilling out of the tunnel like shadows come to life. They moved with an unnatural speed, their hollow eyes fixed on me. I sprinted for the truck, my heart pounding. As I reached it, I turned back, expecting to see them closing in. But they stopped at the edge of the clearing, their movements halting, as though an invisible barrier held them back. They stared at me, their hollow sockets filled with a quiet, menacing rage. For a moment, I thought I was safe. Then I saw it. The gnarled oak tree was changing. Its roots writhed, tearing free from the earth, and its bark split open to reveal a dark, pulsing mass within. From that mass emerged a creature, taller than any human, its body a writhing amalgamation of wood, moss, and shadow. Its face was a hollow void, much like the figures that served it, but its presence was infinitely more terrifying. It let out a deafening roar, a sound that shook the very ground beneath my feet. The figures around it bowed, their twisted forms sinking to the earth in reverence. The creature's gaze, or what I assumed was its gaze, turned to me. I didn't wait to find out what it wanted. I jumped into the truck, slamming the door and flooring the gas pedal. The tires spun in the loose dirt before finding traction, and I sped away, the beam of my headlights cutting through the suffocating darkness. As I drove, the forest came alive. Shadows darted between the trees, keeping pace with the truck. The sulfur smell grew stronger, almost unbearable, and the roar of the creature echoed in the distance. It felt like the entire northern reach was coming after me. By some miracle, I made it back to the station. Brian was still there, his face lighting up with relief when he saw me. But that relief quickly turned to fear as he saw the state I was in. "What happened?" he asked, but I couldn't answer. I collapsed into a chair, my body trembling with exhaustion. For the next few days, I stayed away from the northern reach. But the forest didn't stay away from me. At night, I heard whispers outside my window, voices that sounded like Nathan and the others. Shadows moved in the corners of my vision, always just out of reach. And that sulfur smell, it lingered no matter how far I went. I reported everything to my superiors, but they dismissed it as stress and exhaustion. They closed off the northern reach, citing environmental concerns. But I knew it was only a matter of time before someone else ventured in, someone who wouldn't be as lucky as I was. Because the forest is alive, and it remembers. The days that followed my harrowing escape from the northern reach were marked by an overwhelming sense of dread. The forest's grip on my mind hadn't loosened. If anything, it was tightening. Every creak of a tree outside my window felt like the watchers were coming for me. Every gust of wind carried with it the faint stench of sulfur. I was a man haunted, and I wasn't sure I'd ever be free. Brian stayed with me at the ranger station, unwilling to leave me alone, though he was equally unwilling to discuss what we'd experienced. He seemed to want to pretend it never happened, but I couldn't. Not when every detail was etched so deeply into my memory. One night, as the wind howled outside, I sat with a mug of coffee in hand, staring blankly at the map of the northern reach spread across the table. The cavern wasn't marked, nor were any of the strange features I'd encountered. It was as though the forest itself had hidden them. My flashlight sat beside the map, its beam a feeble reminder of how utterly outmatched I'd been. Brian broke the silence. "You can't keep going over it like this. It'll drive you insane." "I'm already halfway there," I muttered, my eyes fixed on the map. There's something in that forest, Brian. Something ancient, something wrong. He sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. And what do you want to do about it? Go back? Face that thing again? It's not worth it, man. Let someone else deal with it. No one else will, I said, my voice low but firm. They closed off the northern reach, but we both know that won't stop people. And when someone else goes missing, the higher-ups will ignore it like they ignored Nathan's case. Like they always do. Brian was quiet for a long time. Finally, he asked, "Do you think Nathan's still in there?" I didn't answer right away. The image of Nathan's hollow sockets and twisted posture flashed through my mind. Whatever he had become, it wasn't Nathan anymore. But his question lingered. Was there still some part of Nathan trapped in that monstrous form? Could he be saved? I didn't know, and the uncertainty gnawed at me. A sudden knock at the door shattered the silence, making both of us jump. It was nearly midnight, and no one ever came to the station at this hour. Brian and I exchanged a wary glance before I grabbed my flashlight and opened the door. A woman stood on the porch, her face pale and streaked with tears. She clutched a photograph in her hands, which trembled as she held it out to me. "Please," she begged, "you have to help me. My husband went missing in the northern reach. They said you're the one who knows that area." I stared at the photograph. Her husband's face was smiling, full of life, completely unaware of the horrors lurking in the forest. I looked back at the woman, her desperate eyes pleading for answers I wasn't sure I could give. "I'll help you," I said, ignoring the look of disbelief on Brian's face. "But I need you to tell me everything you know, where he was last seen, why he went there, anything." She nodded quickly, her words tumbling out in a rush. Her husband, a wildlife photographer, had ventured into the northern reach to document the untouched beauty of the area. He hadn't believed the warnings about the forest being off limits. His last message had been a text sent 3 days ago, saying he'd found something incredible. I felt a chill run down my spine. Did he say what he found? She shook her head. Just that it was otherworldly. Brian grabbed my arm, pulling me aside. "You can't be serious," he hissed. "You're going back in there? After everything?" I met his gaze, my jaw set. "If we don't, she'll never see her husband again. You know that." Brian hesitated, then let out a long sigh. "Fine, but if we're doing this, we're doing it smart. No splitting up, no wandering off the trail, and if we see anything, we're out of there. Agreed?" "Agreed," I said, though I wasn't sure I believed it myself. The woman insisted on coming with us, and while I wanted to refuse, I knew she wouldn't take no for an answer. We set out at dawn, the forest shrouded in mist that seemed to cling to our skin. The sulfur smell returned as soon as we entered the northern reach, faint but unmistakable. I felt the weight of unseen eyes on us, the watchers already aware of our presence. We followed the trail as far as it would take us, then ventured off toward the coordinates the woman provided. The deeper we went, the more unnatural the forest became. The trees twisted and gnarled, their bark covered in that black moss that pulsed faintly with life. The air grew colder, and the mist thickened, muffling our footsteps. We found the photographer's camp near the base of a craggy hill. His tent was intact, but the inside was empty. A camera lay on the ground, its screen cracked but still functional. I picked it up and scrolled through the photos, my stomach turning with each one. The images started innocently enough, landscapes, wildlife, the kind of shots you'd expect from a professional photographer. But then they changed. The photos grew darker, more chaotic. Twisted figures appeared in the background, their hollow eyes glowing faintly. The last photo made my blood run cold. It was of the cavern, its yawning mouth illuminated by the faint glow of a flashlight. Standing in the entrance was a figure, its face hidden in shadow but unmistakably human. The woman gasped, recognizing her husband's silhouette. "That's him," she whispered. "That's my husband." Before I could respond, a low growl echoed through the forest, followed by the unmistakable sound of footsteps. Many footsteps. "They're here," Brian said, his voice tight with fear. The watchers emerged from the mist, their twisted forms closing in on us. I raised my flashlight, but its beam flickered and died, the batteries drained in an instant. The woman screamed as the figures surrounded us, their hollow sockets fixed on her. "We need to move," I said, grabbing her arm and pulling her toward the hill. "Brian, cover us." He pulled out his flare gun and fired into the crowd, the red light momentarily scattering the watchers. We scrambled up the hill, the cavern looming ahead. I didn't want to go back in, but it was the only place left to run. Inside, the sulfur smell was overpowering, and the walls seemed to pulse with a sinister rhythm. The woman called out for her husband, her voice echoing in the dark. I shone my flashlight around, praying it wouldn't fail me again. Then we saw him. He was standing in the center of the cavern, his back to us. At first glance, he looked normal, alive. But as we got closer, I saw the truth. His movements were jerky, unnatural, and his skin was pale, almost translucent. When he turned to face us, his eyes were hollow sockets, and his mouth stretched into a grotesque grin. The woman screamed, running toward him despite my shouts to stop. She reached out to him, but the moment she touched his arm, the cavern trembled. The black moss spread across the walls, and a deafening roar filled the space. The watchers poured into the cavern, their forms merging with the shadows. The moss writhed, forming tendrils that reached for us. I grabbed the woman, dragging her back as the photographer's body contorted, his grin stretching wider and wider until it split his face in two. "Run!" I shouted. We bolted for the exit, Brian firing flares to hold off the watchers. The forest came alive around us, the trees groaning and twisting as though trying to trap us. The sulfur smell burned in my throat, and the air grew thick with whispers. Somehow we made it back to the station. The woman was inconsolable, sobbing uncontrollably as Brian and I barricaded the doors. We didn't sleep that night, the whispers continuing until dawn. I quit my job the next day, unable to face the forest again. But the northern reach hasn't left me. At night, I dream of the cavern and the twisted forms within. The whispers follow me, no matter where I go, and sometimes, when I look into the mirror, I see hollow sockets staring back. The days after the harrowing escape became a haze of exhaustion and paranoia. Even in the safety of my apartment, I couldn't shake the sensation of being watched. The air felt heavier, carrying a faint but unmistakable sulfuric tang, a lingering echo of the northern reach. Nights were the worst. The shadows in my room seemed to shift and move, and every creak of the floorboards felt like an intruder stepping closer. I tried to convince myself it was over. I had quit the ranger station. I had handed over my resignation, citing health reasons. Brian had supported me, though his expression was clouded with worry. "You did the right thing," he'd said. "But you're not okay, are you?" I wasn't. I had replayed that final night in the cavern endlessly. The moment the photographer turned, his grotesque grin splitting his face, the roar that seemed to shake the world apart, and the watchers, they weren't just creatures of the forest. They were something older, something tied to the land itself. I couldn't prove it, but deep down, I knew they weren't confined to the northern reach. They could come for me anywhere. The woman I had rescued had left a voicemail the next morning, thanking me for saving her life, though her voice was hollow. She'd said something I couldn't forget. It wasn't him. Not really. But it wore his face so well. Her words haunted me. If the watchers could imitate humanity so convincingly, how could I trust anyone? How could I even trust myself? 2 weeks passed in uneasy solitude. I avoided going outside unless absolutely necessary, but even then I felt the watcher's presence. It was subtle, a shadow darting just out of sight. A faint whisper filled the wind. I told myself it was paranoia, but the feeling never left me. One night, as I sat in my dimly lit living room, the air grew unnaturally still. The ever-present sounds of the city, cars, distant chatter, barking dogs, faded into silence. My heart raced as I glanced toward the window. The streetlights outside flickered, and the faint glow of the moon seemed to dim. I reached for the flashlight I now kept by my side at all times, but as I turned it on, the beam faltered, flickering weakly before dying completely. Panic clawed at me. I scrambled for my phone, desperate to call Brian, but the screen refused to light up. Every electronic device in the apartment went dead, plunging me into an oppressive darkness. The sulfuric smell filled the room, sharper than before, and I heard it a whisper so faint I couldn't make out the words. But it felt wrong. It came from everywhere and nowhere at once, crawling under my skin. A soft creak echoed from the kitchen. My breath caught in my throat as I turned toward the sound. A shadow moved just at the edge of my vision, too tall to be anything human. I backed away slowly, my pulse pounding in my ears. The whispering grew louder, resolving into fragmented phrases. "You brought us here. You cannot escape." I stumbled into the bedroom, slamming the door shut and shoving a chair under the handle. My hands trembled as I grabbed a knife from my bedside drawer. The whispers continued, growing louder and more dissonant, like dozens of voices overlapping. The air grew colder, and the walls seemed to close in. My breath came in shallow gasps as a loud bang reverberated through the apartment, followed by the unmistakable sound of footsteps. They were heavy, deliberate, and they were getting closer. "Brian," I whispered under my breath, a desperate plea. I didn't know if he could help, but I needed someone, anyone, to break through this nightmare. The footsteps stopped outside the bedroom door. My grip tightened on the knife as the handle jiggled. The chair under the knob rattled, and then the banging started. Each thud sent a jolt of terror through me, the door groaning under the force. Then the banging stopped. The silence was deafening, stretching on for what felt like hours but was likely only seconds. My heart raced as I strained to hear any sound, any hint at what was happening on the other side of the door. The whispers came back, louder now, and closer. They surrounded me, suffocating me with their intensity. I gritted my teeth, trying to block them out, but they grew overwhelming, a cacophony of fragmented words and sinister intent. "You should not have returned. You belong to us now." The door burst open with a deafening crash, the chair splintering into pieces. I screamed, raising the knife, but what stepped through the doorway wasn't human. It was one of the watchers, its twisted form silhouetted against the dim glow of the hallway. Its hollow sockets locked onto me, and its grin stretched impossibly wide. I lunged, slashing with the knife, but it moved with inhuman speed, its long, spindly fingers wrapping around my wrist. The blade fell from my grasp as it pulled me close, its rancid breath filling my lungs. I kicked and struggled, but its grip was ironclad. Just as I thought it would drag me into the darkness, the whispers reached a fever pitch. The air rippled around us, and a new figure stepped through the doorway. For a moment I thought it was Brian, but the way it moved, fluid, almost weightless, wasn't right. The figure raised a hand, and the watcher released me, letting out a guttural screech. The whispers ceased, and the air grew still. I stared in shock as the figure turned to face me. It was Nathan, or what was left of him. His hollow sockets stared through me, his expression unreadable. His voice was a distorted echo as he spoke. "You brought them here. Now you must face them." Before I could respond, the world around me dissolved into darkness. I felt weightless, as though I were falling. And then I hit the ground hard. I woke up in the middle of the northern reach, the twisted trees looming over me. The sulfuric smell was stronger than ever, and the whispers had returned, faint but persistent. My body ached, and my knife was gone. In its place was a note, scrawled in a shaky hand. "You cannot leave. You are part of this now. Finish what you started." I sat there, trembling, as the realization sank in. The Watchers weren't just hunting me. They were tethered to me, drawn by my very presence. I was a part of their twisted world now, and there was no escaping it. But as despair threatened to consume me, a spark of determination flared. I couldn't let them win. If they wanted me to finish this, I would. I would find the source of their power, the heart of the forest, and I would destroy it, even if it killed me. I stood in the heart of the northern reach, the whispers a deafening roar in my mind. The twisted forest loomed around me, a maze of shadowy trees and unnatural angles. The sulfuric stench clung to my lungs, and the air itself seemed to pulse with a malicious energy. I didn't know how I had come back here, whether I had been taken, led, or simply drawn by some invisible force, but I knew this was the end. One way or another, the note had burned itself into my memory. Finish what you started. The Watchers were coming. I could feel their presence growing closer, like an approaching storm. Every nerve in my body screamed at me to run, but I knew there was nowhere to go. The forest wouldn't let me escape, not this time. I gripped the flare gun I had found near a discarded ranger pack, likely someone else who had met their end here. It was a flimsy weapon, barely better than nothing, but it was all I had. My flashlight flickered weakly, its beam struggling against the oppressive darkness. The path twisted ahead, leading to a clearing. At its center stood a massive gnarled tree. Its roots dug deep into the earth, pulsating with a dark, unnatural light. The whispers grew louder as I approached, each step like wading through a thick, suffocating fog. This was it, the heart of the forest, the source of the Watchers' power. The clearing was littered with remnants of the past, shattered tents, rusted tools, and bones. So many bones. A chilling wind swept through, carrying the stench of decay. The whispers were deafening now, words I couldn't understand pressing against my mind. I raised the flare gun, aiming it at the pulsating tree. My hand shook violently, sweat dripping into my eyes. This was madness. How could a single flare stop whatever this was? But I had no other choice. A guttural growl tore through the air, and the shadows shifted around me. The Watchers emerged from the darkness, their twisted forms silhouetted against the faint glow of the tree. There were more of them than I had ever seen, their hollow eyes locked onto me, their toothy grins stretching wider. They didn't charge. They didn't need to. They circled me like predators playing with their prey, their movements slow and deliberate. They were waiting, feeding off my fear. I squeezed the trigger. The flare shot through the air, its crimson light cutting through the darkness. It struck the tree with a blinding flash, and for a moment, the whispers stopped. The forest held its breath. Then the ground erupted. The roots of the tree twisted violently, the earth splitting open as a torrent of black ichor spewed forth. The Watchers howled in rage, their forms flickering like dying embers. The light from the tree grew brighter, searing my eyes, and the air filled with a deafening roar. I stumbled backward, barely keeping my footing as the clearing collapsed into chaos. The Watchers lunged at me, their movements desperate and erratic. I fired another flare, aiming at the closest one, and it disintegrated into a spray of ash and shadows. But there were too many. One of them slammed into me, its claws tearing into my side. Pain erupted through my body as I fell to the ground, the wind knocked from my lungs. Another Watcher loomed over me, its hollow sockets burning with malice, its claws raised high, poised for the killing blow. I closed my eyes, bracing for the end. Then, a blinding light consumed the clearing. The Watchers screamed, their forms disintegrating into smoke and ash. The whispers dissolved into silence, and the oppressive darkness lifted. I opened my eyes to see the massive tree burning, its roots curling in on themselves as the black ichor boiled away. The ground shook violently, and the clearing began to collapse. I forced myself to my feet, clutching my bleeding side, and stumbled toward the edge of the clearing. The forest blurred around me as I ran, each step a battle against the pain and exhaustion. The whispers were gone, but their absence was almost worse. The silence was suffocating, the weight of what had just happened pressing down on me. I didn't stop running until the forest thinned and the first rays of dawn broke through the trees. I collapsed on the side of an old trail, gasping for breath. The sulfuric stench was gone, replaced by the clean, crisp air of the early morning. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, I was free. But the cost. I thought of the others who had been lost to the forest, the woman, the photographer, Nathan. Their faces flashed through my mind, each one a painful reminder of the lives the watchers had claimed. I had survived, but I couldn't shake the feeling that the forest wasn't done with me. Brian found me hours later, pale and shaking. He didn't ask questions, just helped me into his truck and drove me back to the station. The medics patched me up, and my supervisor filed my resignation without a word. They didn't need an explanation. The haunted look in my eyes was enough. As I lay in the hospital bed that night, staring at the ceiling, a single thought consumed me. I couldn't go back. Not to the forest, not to that life, but I couldn't leave it behind either. Not completely. Because deep down, I knew the Northern Reach wasn't done with me. Not yet. And when it called, I would have no choice but to answer.